today. This relates to the Grenfell tragedy, which happened more than 7 years ago. And we've learned 12 buildings in Essex still have safety issues with cladding more than 7 years after that fatal fire in London. Now, the long-awaited report into the fire at Grenfell, which claimed the lives of 72 people, is going to be published in just a matter of hours. It will examine how that tower block came to be in a condition that allowed the fire to spread. Well, here, Essex County Fire and Rescue Service has told BBC Essex there are more than 150 high-rise residential buildings in Essex. Among them, 12 currently have safety issues related to external cladding, which Essex Fire Service is actively addressing. Jennifer Vickers is a director of the residence management company at Morello Quarter in Basildon. This is a building that remains trapped in this safety crisis. Good morning to you, Jennifer. Thanks for joining us.
Good morning. Thanks for covering this story.
You're welcome. It's an important one, and obviously we've got the report coming out today, haven't we, in terms of Grenfell. Tell us a bit about the situation where you are then.
So Morello Quarter is a really large development. It's about 426 flats. And not long after Grenfell, we were made aware that our building has many of the similar fire safety issues that building design had. And that was, well, as you say, nearly 7 years ago. And our building is still made from and covered in the same materials and the same combustible elements and factors that were in place at Grenfell and caused that absolute tragedy.
And how are you feeling about the fact that there is similar materials and it still remains in place in your home, in your building?
So this is now a really hard place to live, because not only does it have that horrible, scary label that this building is a high risk to life, and that's what it's been certified and assessed to be, but also the costs of living here now in this uncertainty are absolutely extortionate. The building is barely insurable, and people are paying thousands and thousands of pounds a year to insure tiny, 1 and 2 bedroom flats. The costs of all of the fire regulation and the ongoing assessments and the ongoing certifications that are now required are really, really expensive, and the flats can't be bought or sold. So people are stuck here, whether they're in relationships that have broken down, they want to start families, they want to take promotions, they want to move on with their lives. These flats are completely unshiftable because lenders won't lend on them. So it is literally like having your life at fear because they have a high risk to life and they're made of such dangerous materials, and also having your life completely squashed by something that you just are not in control of.
Well, this is it. I was going to say, some people may want to move on and sell for lots of different reasons, but they can't, as you said. Others want to stay there, perhaps, but it must be taking its toll mentally, knowing that it might not be safe to live there.
Yeah, I think it's a really hard thing to live amongst, especially when you've got to find a lot of extra money and you're obviously worried about your family's safety. I think it's really hard when we know obviously the developers, Western Homes of this building, are still continuing to build other new developments and build other new properties all over Essex, and yet we're still waiting for them to put our building right, and that's a really hard thing to have to watch happening around you as well.
I've got quite a long statement which I'll read from Western Homes in a bit, but they're saying that the work, they're ready to carry out the work, but it's been delayed while the option of government funding was explored by residents. But as you've mentioned there, it does seem to be taking a bit of time, doesn't it?
Yeah, I mean, we were in a better position when we were funded by the government. So we actually got approved for government funding to have this building put right because it is so dangerous. And we were actually approved for a completely non-combustible solution. So the building would have been replaced with a concrete covering. There would have been no wood, no combustible insulation at all. And unfortunately, when the government then realised quite what an extent of taxpayer burden that would create if the government had to put right every single impacted building, they then reached out to the original builders and developers and asked them to foot the bills instead. Sadly for us, the solution and the design that the developer is willing to fund is so much lower in its kind of scope than what the government would have funded. It actually even means that the combustible materials stay on the building. So the developer's approach to fixing this is simply to add a few extra fire safety measures, but leave all the combustible and flammable materials in place. So we would have been so much better off had we have been continued to be served and kind of mitigated by that government scheme rather than having our developer step in, because it's amazing how suddenly all these risks that we were told about for years and years that the government was going to put right, the developer's solution now seems tolerable of. And so we're very keen to find any way possible to retain the design and the non-combustible mitigations that the government had originally promised, rather than take this very low scope solution from our developer.
Yes, I was going to say, where are your understanding? Where are we at now with it?
Yeah, so we appealed to the government to say, please, can we have a concrete building? Please, can we have a non-combustible building? Because we'll never be able to buy and sell these buildings. We'll never be able to afford the insurance unless we get this flammable materials off. But they said, unfortunately, your developer has committed to kind of putting it right to some extent. So you're going to have to go with them to ease the taxpayer burden, which I understand. So we are now waiting for those works to start. But whether that actually unblocks this situation in terms of safety. Be interesting to hear kind of Essex Fire and Rescue Services point of view on this much lower scope, much smaller mitigation versus the original design that they worked on with the government. And then also, will it unblock lenders willing to lend if the building is still made of combustible materials? Will we be able to insure the building even if it's still made of combustible materials? So of course, we all want a start date and we all want to see something happen after 7 years, but I'm concerned that even if we get to that point, we won't really resolve all of the ongoing challenges that make this such a difficult and expensive place to live.
Yeah, and as you've said, it's a complicated setup, but still a lot of questions remaining for you and other residents. Jennifer, all the best. Keep us posted on it. Jennifer Vickers, the director of the residents management company at Morello Quarter in Basildon, just been telling us about that particular building. Well, we did approach Western Homes to get a statement and ask where they're at, and it's quite a long statement, but I'm going to read it to you. So they told us in 2022, we'd agreed to carry out these works ourselves and were at an advanced stage of making the required arrangements to do so. During 2023, the responsible entity for the residents of Morello Quarter wanted to explore the option of government funding with a view to appointing their own chosen contractor and managing the remedial works themselves for the government to then claim back the costs from Western Homes. This was via the new Building Safety Fund process. Whilst Western Homes respected the responsible entity's view to explore the self-funding, we were also in regular dialogue, providing them the reassurance that if they chose not to go the self-funding route, then Western Homes would appoint a contractor, manage and fund the remedial works. We have also previously agreed to repay the related costs incurred to date by the residents. Early in 2024, the responsible entity decided after all that Western Homes could manage the works. However, at this point, a new building safety regulator procedure was introduced. That's meant Western Homes has had to make a very detailed application to them prior carrying out these works. These will be submitted in September. As soon as the application is accepted by the BSR, we will instruct our appointed contractor to commence the works immediately. Western Homes are aware of the urgency, they say, with which the residents wish this to be resolved. Our team is ready to commence the works. Quite a long statement there, but we will certainly stay across this as well. That's their response to what's going on at that block in Basildon. Well, joining me now is Jamie Newell. Now, Jamie is the Executive Council member for the Fire Brigade Union in the East. Morning to you, Jamie. Thanks for coming on today.
Good morning.
Morning. We've got this final report coming out relating to Grenfell in London this morning. From the FBU's point of view, what does this final report tell us about the situation and the cladding that was used?
Well, I think it's important to note that the second phase is embargoed and the core participants get the first shot at reading it before it's released fully.
Yeah.
The phases of the Grenfell report were broken down into the way the building was made, the actions that were taken in terms of how it was amended over the years, and then the second phase talks around the timeline of the events, how the incident developed and moves on from there. I think it's important to turn our attention essentially to the 72 people who died needlessly, and every single resident who's still impacted to this day by what happened that night. And I don't know if you've ever been to one of the silent memorial marches at Grenfell that they hold, but the FBU has been sending delegations from across the UK to support and remember the community when they turn up. It's really a harrowing and emotional event to go to. And I don't know if you're familiar with Tony Benn's two fires in the human heart, but he used to say that the flame of fire against injustice and the flame of hope that we can build a better world burn within the human heart.
Yeah.
And I would encourage you to go and listen to the pain of the children who lost loved ones in 2017 who are now young adults today who are filled with that fire of an injustice, and they will not be silenced or go away.
Yeah, and you used the word that was going through my mind as you were talking there, harrowing. It's a harrowing incident for all concerned, including the people that had to respond from a firefighter's perspective on the night. And, you know, we've been hearing more about it, learning more about it and in the years since. What's changed for firefighters since that incident, would you say?
Well, I think the brutal truth is not much. It's a national scandal that this happened in the first place, and it's been a sick result of decades of deregulation in the building sector. Listening to the lady that was just on before me, there's still around 5,000 odd homes still affected by this in the UK, and we've seen in the last week significant incidents in Dagenham and in Slough, where hundreds of firefighters who have worked in arduous conditions to try and resolve these incidents. Thankfully, nobody's been seriously injured, but the harsh reality is that we shouldn't be surprised that this happened. There were already several high-profile incidents of this occurring before the incident at Grenfell. I was actually living out in Melbourne in November 2014, I think it was, where an ACM-cladded building went up in flames, but thankfully no one was hurt. And those homeowners were able to get, in receipt of millions of pounds worth of dollars in damages back in 2019, and the cladding was removed in 2017. But the picture here in Essex is very different. There was a building review carried out in August, or between August 2020 and December 2022, I believe it was, and that reported to the Fire Rescue and Crime Commissioner Authority in 2023, outlining that there was 182 buildings considered a risk for a variety of factors, including in some cases the cladded buildings or floors. Now, I've just listened to the comments that were made previously, and that building was on that list.
Yeah.
And operationally, the picture in Essex is a challenging one, owing to the level of cuts that the brigade seen since 2010.
And your fear, as you said, there's been high-profile incidents before Grenfell, sadly, and since, as you mentioned, that the Dagenham one very, very recently. Is your fear then that unless some of this stuff is remedied, we could be seeing more incidents like this, which are, ultimately potentially quite serious fires?
Again, if you just go into the Grenfell silent marches, the people walk around with placards with excerpts of the emails between the companies that put that stuff around that building, knowing that it was a flammable risk. Listening to that company, the email that you just read out, just get on with it. They were they're quick enough to put it up when the money was coming in. They didn't ask any questions, and now the time is just to get it done. The dither and delay that big business does when it comes to remedying things that have gone wrong is not good enough. In Essex, we've seen between 2010 and 2020 a reduction of 227 firefighters, or 16% of its workforce. And I would just add, I was doing a little digging around for an example of cuts, and I went back through some social media. Now, there was an incident that took place in 2018. One pump Basildon was sent to Benfleet, to a fire in Benfleet. One pump Basildon was sent to a fire at Canvey. Both those stations had cuts, and that left no pumps in Basildon, and then Basildon had a fire. Now, the impact and the damage that's been done to operational response in the fire service since 2010 is unmistakable. We're at the point now where we can't deal with multiple incidents. And even the HMI, CFRS, which is the government or His Majesty's Inspectorate for Police and Fire, has been critical of Essex for contravening working time practices, where essentially they've been allowing firefighters to work more hours than they should to provide fire cover because they haven't got enough to go around. So they're compromising people's rest periods to cover over the cracks, and due to the squeeze of funding, and it's a recipe for disaster, and we see it time and again.
Yeah, I was just going to say, it sort of adds to the pressure given the context we're talking about, the way in which buildings are constructed and some of the materials used around that, and the fears and the pressures there, and then the pressures you've been talking about within firefighter services like here in Essex as well. Jamie, thank you for coming on. Jamie Newell, the Exec Council member for the Fire Brigade Union, the FBU, here in the East, just giving sort of fire service perspective here. Well, listening to that and joining me now at 8:23 is Zoe Bartley. Zoe is the founder of Essex Cladding Action Group and also a spokesperson for the End Our Cladding Scandal campaign. Thank you for coming on, Zoe. And I think we've chatted before, haven't we? The reason you're involved in a lot of this is because you've had some personal involvement in the cladding scandal. Tell us a bit about your story, Zoe.
Thank you for having me on this morning. Yeah, so I ended up spending 4 years stuck in a building that didn't have the right building safety classification standard on the external wall, so we didn't have the right certificate to show that our external wall was safe. And we spent 3 of those years being told that the external wall wasn't safe before it was eventually reclassified. So I spent a long time reading about cladding and the building safety. Look, we now know it's not just cladding; it's all aspects of the external wall safety.
And what do you think about the situation? So we've got the second and final report coming out in terms of Grenfell, and in terms of what's going on here in Essex. We've learned, there are a number of buildings in our county still with safety issues with cladding all these years down the line, and others elsewhere in the country as well. What's your view on that and the fact that we're still having these conversations and talking about these things not being done in 2024?
I just think there's been so much delay and it's taken such a long time. And first and foremost of the Grenfell inquiry, the priority has to be getting justice for the victims and the bereaved and making sure that charges are brought against the people who knew they were putting unsafe materials in these buildings and did nothing to stop it, and disregarded the lives and well-being of the residents who are living in the building. It's absolutely appalling that it was allowed to happen in the first place. Following on from that, I know that the person you were speaking to before was talking about how there were so many buildings still affected and that we're not seeing the full scale of it. I think the government estimates there's over 11,000 buildings above 11 metres that have this issue. And they're only monitoring around 4,600 of those buildings, but there are still plenty of buildings that haven't been assessed or are still awaiting assessment. So the true scale of the issue is pretty massive and not been dealt with. And continues in lots of questions, lots of question marks still to this day for a lot of buildings. And just remind us then, so you were caught up in this situation. You were in your place for 4 years? How did you resolve it? Has it been resolved, Zoe? So I lived in the flat for 7 years. 4 of those years were shrouded by the building safety cladding scandal. We were initially given a B2 rating on our external wall safety certificate, which said that the building had flammable cladding and that flammable cladding wasn't safe, or the external wall in its whole wasn't safe. 3 years down the line, our building owner accepted they were going to pay for the remediation work that was needed. Yeah. And then within 6 months of that, suddenly the building was classified as safe and didn't require any remedial work. So make of that what you will.
Mm. Is that how it's been left?
Yes.
That's how it's been left? Okay. And you still in? Are you still in that property?
No, so I'm considered one of the lucky ones who managed to escape. But I still have many friends and people I speak to who are still stuck in buildings, like you said, all across the country, who are at risk of another tragedy like this occurring.
And it's just, we've been hearing in this half an hour a real worry for all of those people who still live in buildings where some of this work needs to be done and is yet to be done. Thanks for joining us, Zoe. Zoe Bartley, the founder of the Essex Cladding Action Group, also a spokesperson for End Our Cladding Scandal. Rico Vojtolovic is Head of Policy and Market Insight at the National Federation of Builders with me now. What's your take on the situation, Rico? Morning.
Hi, good morning, Sonia. God, it has been an awful 7 years for the leaseholders, and I think from our perspective, there's a couple of things really. So what the government decided to do is not fix the issue. So the last government kind of made a hash of it, and what they did is they said, right, to fund it, instead of using incredibly low interest rates, and just kind of fund all these repairs and get leaseholders out of a hole, they thought they'd tax the whole of the construction industry. So if you're a developer tomorrow, you start a company tomorrow as a developer, you'll be paying for the stuff that's going on with the cladding scandal. And so what that means is there's not money in the pot yet to get all the works done, and it's a slow process and new things keep coming up. So from the outset, the leaseholders have been so let down by a government fudge when they should have just got these works done and then came after the people that were at fault. So in those terms, it's terrible. But there's also kind of other elements here that are at play, because obviously we've got the second report coming out today, and we should find out a little bit more as to what all the broader faults were, because look, cladding, so the way it's done is they did a desktop study, which is, they weren't, the cladding that was used, we now know should have been banned. So there were regulatory issues there that the government overlooked and ignored the recommendations on. But there were lots of other elements, and it's going to be, interesting isn't the right word to use, but it's going to be really informative to find out what else we need to understand. So whether there were any building changes, whether the local authority did the right works to keep the building up to date. What processes might need to change for the fire service, if there is any, what the chain of command is, in order to save people if the worst comes to it. But the construction industry has had some changes as well, so there's going to be a change in who's accountable for the works that are done. There's more photographic evidence taken as works continuing. So really, I think that we just need to kind of come up with a solution. Again, isn't the right word, but we just need to come up with a process that makes sure this doesn't happen again in future buildings. If it happens in existing buildings, we know what the problems are and how to solve it, because there are too many people here, too many innocent people being blamed.
Could the building industry be doing more and some of the developers be doing more? Because, a lot of people say, well, they've been passing the buck a little bit or delaying things or not necessarily being as satisfactory in responses, some of the developers of other buildings, as what residents and leaseholders would want. Do they need to up the game a little bit?
Well, look, it's funny how you define a developer. So a lot of the bigger companies and even the existing building companies that perhaps are developers in the classic senses they build buildings, they have been doing a pretty decent job. The issue we've got is there are things called orphan buildings, which are people that build a building and then close their company. We don't know who they are, they're a foreign company. So how you get them to pay for it is very difficult. And also you get people that are effectively investors and they're not really builders. They subcontract everything to other companies. Now, they're obviously blaming the other companies, which is right if the works is wrong, then you have to blame those companies, that's fine. Yeah. But how do you get it? They're not builders, they're not developers, so they're just investors. So if you're just targeting developers, which is what the government has done, you're actually letting those people off. And what's happening there is, again, as I said at the start, leaseholders are the ones that are paying for it. And not just in terms of, the waiting watch and the cost and the inability to sell the ESW1 forms, but the higher costs of insurance and the warranties and the inability to sell and the negative equity on the property, which means, what they've borrowed is more than what the property's worth. And there's some of those things that are being passed to the whole construction industry. If you're building 2 houses, you're paying higher premiums because of this disaster of Grenfell, and also the disastrous response by the government, who, if I'm completely honest, the last one, completely and utterly absolved themselves of responsibility, and they blamed everybody else apart from their regulatory failures.
Well, Rico, thank you for joining us this morning as well to talk about this, and I'm sure there'll be more later in the day as that Grenfell report is released. Rico Vojtolovic, Head of Policy and Market Insight at the National Federation of Builders. It's almost 8:32.